I'm thrilled to turn this over to my good friend and colleague, Monica Higgins, who is a professor of here at the graduate and a leader here at the Graduate School of Education. What I love about Monica's work, and she will in turn introduce Amy, who's another dear friend, but what I love about Monica's work is it's really about building leadership capacity for organizational change in the public education sector. And if we think about, renewing democracy and creating a higher level of democracy, even economic democracy, as Phil talked about yesterday, education is a huge part of that. And public education is really foundational for getting us there. So I'm very honored to have Monica not only here as our member of our host committee, but as the person who really invited us to use this space and who is such an inspiration to me. Oh.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's just so terrific to have you here on campus. We are a small school, the Graduate School of Education, but we are a mighty school, and we are all about, as one of my students said, fierce change. And I'm so inspired by working with you even just a little bit. As those of you who know, yesterday morning I was teaching, so I'm in and out, and that's going to continue today with my day job. But just to have people in the room who are so energized around thinking about the research as well as the practice as well as the policy and working at that nexus, and to have you all in the same room and so energized. It's been terrific. So for me, I just want to give you a couple of kind of ahas for me, kind of coming to this work. And then I'm so delighted that I have the opportunity to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Amy Edmondson. So just listening to what you were saying, Barbara, Jody and I both have daughters who are working in the K-12 system, traditional public schools. And just yesterday, I was talking to my daughter about this very question about how we kind of flip the narrative. The narrative is so negative right now in terms of public policy and change. And flipping the narrative to think about gratitude, opportunities to express gratitude. And she was actually, my daughter Becky was thinking about how to do this in the classroom. How to get kind of a sense of just kindness, but also acts of kindness into the classroom. And she's working in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which for those of you who know the United States, Connecticut actually has the largest achievement gap. So that was just, so I love that we're kind of thinking about the positive narrative here, as well as we kind of, those of us who are in this public sector space, we don't want to just keep banging our heads against the wall, right? And we're so inspired by what we heard yesterday from Phil Thompson, but we want to think about positive change. And to that, and to your comment as well, I was kind of, as some of you know, flipping back and forth between another session. We have students who are out in residency right now in K-12 districts and nonprofits and so forth. And I had the opportunity last night to hear from one of our students who gave a just amazing talk about the difference between equality and equity. And equality is kind of the nice idea that everybody gets exactly the same thing. And equity is the idea that there are some people who are consistently left out of the conversation. And how do you figure out a way to bring those voices to the table? And that may involve you experiencing loss, we privileged ones experiencing loss. And she equated that and made a kind of distinction between being liberal and being progressive. So when you say kind of being progressive is what Phil Thompson talked about. It's this activist government, it's fierce change, and that's what we're about. So just some thoughts, just on my reflections and integrating. And I hope that as you're kind of thinking today and working with other people, you too will kind of think about, what does this mean for you in your life, you and your work? Yes, you and your research and you and your practice, but also just your everyday lives, How are you kind of bringing people to the table? How are you thinking about creating more equity, for sure, in your work? So we are so happy to have Amy Edmondson here today. She is an amazing colleague and a dear friend, I said. Amy has, Amy Edmondson, so I'm going to call her Amy because she's my friend. She's Professor Edmondson. She's over at Harvard Business School. She is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. And the Novartis Professor of Management and Leadership is really about this study. It's to kind of enable the study of interpersonal relationships at work and what makes them effective, what makes them productive, what makes them generative, which is perfect for Amy's work, because Amy's work is all about creating conditions to enable people to learn and grow at work, and through their work to produce extraordinary outcomes for people in need. Oftentimes her work is in healthcare, but not exclusively. So although Amy is over at Harvard Business School, she is somebody who's a friend of Harvard Ed School. She's somebody who's over at the medical school, the School of Public Health. She's an expansive thinker, and in fact has been named one of the top 50 global thinkers over and over and over again. And she's prolific as well. Yes, I'm going to go on. Just one sec. Okay, so her work is on teaming. So Amy's work at looking at those interpersonal relationships started out looking at teams as bounded entities, and she has moved that work in the field and thinking about teams to teaming, which she'll talk about as enabling effective practice and collective practice to produce learning on the fly. So she has many, many books, including a book on teaming, how organizations learn through and compete in the knowledge economy. But she's also somebody, and I know this kind of echoes from last night when we were at City Hall, that work, but she's also somebody who thinks about cities. So she has a book called Building the Future, Big Teaming for Audacious Innovation. And we are so excited because she's got a new book coming out in November called The Fearless Organization. So please join me in welcoming Amy Edmondson. The game plan, let me just tell you, the game plan is for Amy. We're going to give Amy the floor for like 40 or so minutes, and here we go, and then we're going to turn it over to you. So be thinking about if you have a couple of questions for Amy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Monica. What a thrill, what a treat to be here. If all work were like this, boy, life would be joyful indeed, which it is. I have to say. So, teaming. You know, what is teaming? I'm going to give you a definition in just a little while, but the truth is, you all know this already. It's relational coordination, right? It's the act of coordinating and really recognizing the humanity of the people that you are coordinating with to get work done that generally can't be scripted in advance, right? So that's kind of where we're going. I was delighted by the invitation, the honor of speaking at this conference, and then I saw the title. I'm like, okay, was that the title I agreed to? I don't know, but I can do it, right? And it inspired me to think a little bit about this issue of teaming across levels. And Monica and Jody and I got together earlier, and we were talking about it. I thought, you know, she's right. There is a cross-level phenomenon here that's worth talking about. So I tried to organize myself to do that. But first, just a little bit of stage setting to remind us of what we already know, that we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous context or time. This is the phrase famously coined by the U.S. Army War College a number of years ago, and now I think increasingly in currency, right? People are really using this term, I think, because we have to. It sounds like something out of Star Trek. That's not what it is, of course, but it has this resonance today. And of course, I think if I look out in this room and say, to what extent does this term resonate? The answer is probably fairly heavily, right? It resonates heavily. So my real question then becomes, how does work get done? I mean, how does work get done? And it will not be from on high, with control, with great coordination preset and merely executed down the line. That just won't really work. So I would argue that today, work in a VUCA world is accomplished by teams and teaming, right? So what is the difference? So teams are defined as a stable, meaning it might be all afternoon, it might be all year, but a reasonably stable group of people who are interdependent in achieving a shared goal. I actually think we got the term from the world of sports, and of course sports teams epitomize this definition. The clear goal couldn't be more clear. You know if you're on the team or not, and so forth and so on. Teaming in contrast is teamwork on the fly. It's coordinating and collaborating across boundaries of all kinds without the luxury of stable team structures. And I really do mean luxury, right? When you can have a stable, well-designed team, by all means do. Right? It's just smart. The research makes this pretty clear. So I'm not talking about this as a design choice. I'm talking about this as a necessity when the work demands it. More on that soon. Right? So healthcare, as Monica said, this is where I've done a lot of my research, and I initially went into healthcare to study teams, to study patient care teams. I found out that that was a more complicated thing, as all of you likely know, than first appears. More on that in a moment. But this, in fact, is a team. This is a team in a healthcare setting, and it's a reasonably stable, bounded team because it is working together on a quality improvement project, a specific project. It could be hand washing. It could be improving relations with another unit. It could be any one of a number of things. It could be error reduction and so on. But these people have committed to each other to work together to make a difference on some problem. So that's a team. And indeed, we find teams in healthcare. We also find teaming. So this is meant to depict an emergency department situation, and we have, if you count the elbows on either side, and I do, at least 4 caregivers who have come together in the moment to care for this patient, and their ability to coordinate, to team, may just make the difference between life and death, certainly between health and less health. And they may not even know each other's name. Right? They may have never worked together before. So that's teaming, right? So that's the necessity of it here is because you don't know exactly what kind of patient is coming in. It's because you have 24/7 operations. It's because you have large shifts and inability to plan down to a tight detail who's doing what at any given time. So the need is on the rise, I would argue, in a VUCA world. And here's the rub. Right? Here's how I like to talk about, in many ways, the most important challenge. I'll talk about several challenges this morning, but the most important challenge recently I've begun to think is this one. Right? So if I ask you, and I am, to think about the people in the organizations where you work to whom you report, and those who report to you, if you have such a thing, and we'll call those vertical relationships. And then I'll say, think about the people in other units, functions, geographies, what have you, whose work intersects with yours, maybe is highly reliant on yours, right? We'll call those horizontal relationships. Now, I've asked this question all over the world, and I'll ask it again here. Which relationships get prioritized in the day-to-day work in your organizations? Horizontal, what? Horizontal, okay, this is an unusual answer. Anyone, what? Very good, KP, yes. Well, we've been working with you guys for a long time, so this is good to hear. Most people will say, in most organizations, vertical. And the next question is, which relationships matter most, right? And if you think about it increasingly, especially in healthcare, it's the horizontal, right? So it's a little bit of a conundrum. It's a conundrum that is well captured, I think, by our friend and colleague Don Sull, who did a study of 250 companies, all in challenging industry settings, IT, pharma, you name it, surveyed managers, engineers, scientists, salespeople, and asked them the following question, basically this question. And here is what he finds. So in this survey, 8,000 folks in these different companies, all good organizations, only 59% of respondents reported that they could rely on colleagues in other units. And this is to follow through on things they've promised to do. compared to 84%, which actually sounds a little low to me, but saying they could rely on people up and down the hierarchy. So here's this gap, right? I mean, we can call it the kind of horizontal, vertical gap, and I think it matters. And it's just a little stage setting to say that teaming, we know we need it. We know it matters. We also know there's certain wiring, socializing, and indeed incentives that can get in the way. In most organizations, maybe not Kaiser Permanente, but most organizations suffer from this phenomenon. Part of it is simply familiarity. You know, the people we know well, the people who are like us, often get an undue share of our attention. This is meant to be a hiring discussion, I'm quite sure, but you know the drill, and it applies quite well. As requested, teaming, teaming when it matters most is for problems that are complex and unpredictable, right? So I'm going to talk about some of my research that, I guess I can't get that far away, teaming at 3 levels. And as I thought about these 3 levels, I think the first is the one that comes to mind most readily, right? That's the teaming that happens between individuals trying to get some task done. And in at least, if not a tight team, at least within a group that recognizes itself as working together, right? Level 2 is the kind of teaming or coordination that happens between groups in organizations to get a task done. And then level 3, and I'm seeing more and more of this, and particularly in the city's work, between people working in different companies, and in fact, sometimes even different industries and sectors. And we're seeing some of that in the education space, healthcare space, et cetera. So I'm going to give you just the tiniest glimpse of some work at each level, and then we'll back up and say, are there takeaways from all of this that are useful for your work. So the first one, this is where I began. This is where probably most team scholars begin, is looking at what happens in these relationships between people in groups. And for me, it started with an accident, an accidental discovery, that is. I was asked many, many years ago now to join, and this was a thrilling invitation, a group of very senior and serious physicians who wanted to assess the level of medication error. This is back in the early 90s when this was a brand new topic, right? People weren't talking about it, and we sure as heck didn't have good measures. And so they set out to develop good measures and find out, what's the baseline here? And they set out in a couple of hospitals that I've disguised here as Memorial and University. And the error rates that they detected on a kind of day-to-day basis with a bunch of trained nurse investigators are expressed in terms of errors, human error, per 1,000 patient days. Okay, that's my little part. Like, I was invited in to see if I could do a survey diagnostic measure of the different units in the study as to how well they functioned as teams. I thought I could do that. I had Richard Hackman's team diagnostic survey, and off I went. I changed the wording to make sure that the language was appropriate and meaningful in the healthcare setting. And I had this, this was going to be my second-year project. It was going to be super easy, super simple. I was going to show, as they had done in aviation before me, that better teams, wait for it, make fewer mistakes. Right? Pretty simple, but I figured I could publish. All right? All right, it's not exactly what happened. So here are the data expressed in terms of errors per 1,000 patient days, lined up in a kind of funny way. It sure looks like I tried to go from biggest to smallest and got a little confused along the way. This is where you say, yeah, you didn't go to MIT like Jody, but Harvard, where you get a little sloppy with the numbers. That's actually not what's going on here. What's the first thing you notice about the numbers, if you can see them? Variation, right? An order of magnitude, right? It's just a huge spread, which the more you think about it, the more implausible it begins to seem. And let's just, for the sake of of discussion, because it's roughly true, say these are adjusted for risk severity and so forth, you say, well, wait a minute. You know, could it really be? Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But when so I get these data. I'm very happy to have data independently collected, not by me. I got my survey data. I run them through the statistical program. I have a correlation, and it's significant, and nothing could be better as a young researcher, right? Except the correlation was in the wrong direction, right? So it wasn't funny, right? It wasn't funny. So, because Richard Hackman's like 6'4", and the idea that I was going to tell him his theory was wrong was not so appealing. So I stepped back and I thought, like, I just couldn't accept that better teams were making more mistakes, right? So, but what else? I thought maybe the better teams are more able and willing to discuss them. Right? Maybe they're not making more, maybe they're more open, more willing to talk about them. I revealed this new hypothesis to the principal investigators, who were not so happy to hear from me. They re-explained that the idea actually had been to collect the definitive error rate, and that was what indeed they had done, which turned out to be a gift, because I had to work really hard to demonstrate the plausibility of this hypothesis. And one thing I did, your colleague, Andy Malinsky, who was then a young research assistant working for Richard Hackman, went out to these 8 units, absolutely blinded to my thinking, to the error data, to the survey data, everything. I said, Andy, just go live there for a while. Come back. Tell me what it's like. He said, I think I can do that. Off he went. Make a long story short. When he came back, he said, wow, they're really different. He said, some of these places, they're really authoritarian, his word, not mine. He said some of them are very, very open. So I now reveal that the sorting rule here is Andy Malinsky's top to bottom, most open to most authoritarian, right? So what we have here is a Spearman rank order correlation of 0.98 between the Malinsky rating system and the actual errors found, discovered, if you will. So on this slide, I've changed errors to detected errors, and I began to think something's really going on here. And of course, the most important thing about this study, ultimately, to me, was that these were units, you know, work groups within very strong organizational cultures, right? So what I began to suspect was that climate, work climate, varies a great deal between groups within organizations, right? Not just between organizations. We had a lot of discussion at the time about culture and corporate culture. That's not what we're talking about here. But of course, I had to, this was an accident, as I said. This is not what I expected. This is not what I was looking for. So I had to actually work hard to do additional research to say that this thing could be measured. I called it psychological safety, team psychological safety, defined it as essentially a belief that you won't be punished or humiliated by your peers, especially for speaking up with ideas, concerns, questions, and yes, even mistakes. You can think of it as a felt permission, almost a felt obligation, but certainly a felt permission for candor. Fast forward, we have a pretty good, robust survey measure of the construct and have measured it in various other studies, which I can tell you about just one very quickly. This is a study I did with Ingrid Nemhard, who is now a full professor at Wharton, a healthcare management expert, and she was a doctoral student at the time. And we studied 23 ICUs in 23 North American hospitals, all of them actively engaged in quality improvement projects. They had, on average, 4 or 5 QI projects underway, and among other things, we had them fill out the survey, assess their psychological safety level, and lo and behold, it varies with status, right? Surprise anyone? No, didn't surprise us either, right? This was hypothesis 1. But what did surprise us, and maybe it shouldn't have, but what did surprise us is that when we looked more carefully, unit by unit, we found that this status-induced psychological safety gap was not consistent across all 23. In fact, in some, psychological safety was exactly the same across a care role group, which meant in others it was far steeper to account for this average pattern. So 2 questions probably come to mind, right? And the first is, does it matter? And the answer to that one was resoundingly yes, right? 3 years into this research, Ingrid and Anita Tucker were able to publish a finding that those with the flat high psychological safety had an 18% reduction in morbidity mortality compared to those with the steep pattern. So it matters, right? It actually matters if we hear from folks on the front line. You know that already. So the second question is, what explains the difference? And the answer was what we called inclusive leadership, which is in the title of this paper. And that simply referred to, in this case, the medical director, say the top doc in the unit. When the medical director was rated by others as proactively inviting input, as accessible, as acknowledging his or her own fallibility, then others felt they could bring their full self to work, full stop, right? So what we know, so when I look, especially at this level 1 of teaming between people within groups at work, this is where psychological safety first showed up. This is where a lot of the research since by myself and others has been done. And what we know, first of all, I want to be clear, this isn't about being nice. It's about recognizing what's needed in a VUCA world. One of the things that we know, as I already said, is that it lives at the group level. It tends to vary as much within organizations as it does between them, in some cases more. Lots and lots of research at this point showing a relationship between psychological safety and various learning behaviors, whether it's error reporting or quality improvement or innovation, creativity, et cetera. Various reviews are out there now. But then you might be wondering, asking yourself, what about performance? And I think the good news is, at this point, we have some fairly robust data on performance as well. But for a while, many people were thinking about it this way. Okay, I get it, right? I understand why psychological safety would help people coordinate, bring their full selves to work, speak up when they need help. But are you asking me to dial it back a little on performance? And my answer was always, I understand how you can think of it that way, and I want to suggest a different mental model, one that looks like this. One that says you have a responsibility on 2 separate dimensions. This isn't a trade-off, right? The 2 separate dimensions are, one is to convey and inspire and coach people to achieve high standards, and then the other is to create a workplace where people honestly believe their full self is welcomed. If you don't do either, I call this the apathy zone. This is where people quit and stay. They're still getting a paycheck, but really, their heart's not in it. This is where so many executives, certainly those who come to the Harvard Business School, worry. I don't want the comfort zone. No, nor do I. In reality, I don't see this much anymore. Where I come to work, I love my colleagues, I love my boss, don't have to work very hard around here. Sorry, those days, if they ever were here, are gone. So this is the one that I lose sleep over. Right? This is where those respiratory therapists in the less well-performing ICUs lived, the anxiety zone. And I don't mean, by the way, anxiety about doing a good job or anxiety about the competition or anxiety about what we're all up against. I mean interpersonal anxiety, just simply that when I'm in over my head, the last person I'm going to reveal that to is my colleague, right, or my boss, right? I just don't think that's possible around here. I think that's a very dangerous workplace, especially in VUCA environments, especially when the stakes are high. I call this the learning zone. I'm simply making the point I don't see this as a trade-off. But the learning zone is, in fact, I would say, one and the same as a high-performance zone in uncertain environments. I also want to just point out that I think where do each and every one of us best learn and grow? Where do we keep gaining skills and insight? And I think it's not in the apathy zone. I think it's not in the comfort zone. It's most certainly not in the anxiety zone. Of course, I think it is up here in the learning zone, which means I also can rename it the high performance zone. So when work is interdependent and uncertain, this is where we need to be. If it isn't, that's okay. Then you can go down where you wish. And if there's not much at stake, go on over, enjoy yourself in the comfort zone. Okay, so last thing I want to say about psychological safety before moving to level 2 is that it was a great joy to wake up about 2 years ago and find that the New York Times Magazine cover story, which I was intrigued, I don't know how many of you saw it that day, but I was certainly intrigued to read it right away because of this title. You know, what did Google learn in its quest to build the perfect team? So they did apparently a 4-year study, and you know Google, they have data. Right, so they had all kinds of data, you know, from where you went to school, gender mix, expertise, you name it. Anything you could name, they threw it in the model and nothing worked. Right? Nothing explained the difference between high-performing and low-performing teams. Nothing, that is, until Julia Rozovsky, who led this long study, and her colleagues encountered the concept of psychological safety in academic papers, no less. And then everything fell into place. Now, I do admit, emphasis added by me. It just isn't every day that you see in the New York Times that one of your papers, and indeed, if you clicked through, you did get to a paper which made me feel pretty good until I started to think about the date. Right, so that paper was published in 1999. So that's a 17-year gestation rate, which is long even for healthcare, right? I mean, for, you know, for medicine, that's long. So, okay, so Google, they have this nice thing on their website, which I think is a very nice graphic saying that these are the 5 things that we believe matter most to high-performing teams. You know, impact, do people think the work makes a difference? Meaning, do I find it personally meaningful? Some structure and clarity certainly can be helpful. And dependability, do my colleagues on my right and my left follow through on what they said they would do? But their quote, not mine, psychological safety was far and away the most important of the 5 dynamics we found, the underpinning of the other 4. So I think it's just worth mentioning that because for teaming, for relational coordination, for working in a VUCA world, we really need this. And so it's going to be something that I think all leaders need to take quite seriously, helping people out. So let me go to level 2. Level 2 is teaming across groups in organizations. And this I'll do very, very quickly and then move to level 3. So I'm just going to give you only one story, one study, if you will, qualitative study, in, again, an unnamed hospital, an ordinary day at University Hospital. It's Friday noon, and there is a patient who's checked by the surgeon after surgery for abdominal tumors, and the white blood cell count has spiked. So there's certainly a serious likelihood of an infection on board. And so the surgeon wants to dig into this further and orders a CT scan, right? So in a sense, the surgeon writes an order, you know, signs the order, and that sets into motion a theoretical process that looks like this. We might call this a process flow description if we were in the manufacturing class. And I won't go through all the details. I'll just put them up here and highlight one quick thing, which is that I should put the role names in blue or something, but that each and every one of these steps is going to be done by a different person with a different skill set. And they are going to have to be done in this order in a timely way with only one deliberate buffer, which is that hour that the contrast liquid has to be on board before the scan can happen. Okay, so now I'll share with you on this next slide when these steps are actually implemented, what it looks like. And it looks like this. So I'll pause for a moment and ask you what, if anything, you notice. If you can see, I'm sorry, the font's a little small. Took a long time. Many things in life take a long time. Necessary long time, unnecessary long time, right? I think that's kind of the takeaway here, right? It's like, okay, I get it. Steps are all happening. By the way, the steps are happening as they should, but not in the proper time frame. Not even close. You know, it's Tuesday by the time we really get this thing done. So this is not good. By the way, this is a hospital that the elevators, et cetera, are full of, and I'll just admit this, it's not in this city, full of posters about how they're the best. What? They're the best.
Patient-centered.
Well, they're patient-centered. They win all the awards for everything, which is really research. But anyway, nonetheless. Okay, so what went wrong? You know this. I would argue, I think with good evidence, that each person did his or her task competently. But each person was also part of a different department, a different functional unit that had their own kind of needs, commitments, schedules, plans, resources to manage. And so they did the task at the time that was convenient to the department, not the patient. Everybody was part of what I might think of as a temporary, very temporary, and highly virtual team to get the CT order executed. But they didn't think of themselves that way. They're not sufficiently aware of their interdependence, really. They're not sufficiently aware that all of these things are part of a larger system, if you will. So what should happen? I think everybody needs to see themselves as part of this team or as part of this teaming process. Nothing happens to the patient without very tight communication horizontally across roles. It means coordinating each step so that it happens at the time that works best for the patient and the process. Nothing happens, nothing touches the patient until this flow of interdependence is enabled and unleashed. And the question then becomes, why is this easier said than done? I think people like me and Jody and Monica and so many others have been kind of devoting our life to the question of why is this easier said than done, and coming up with a few answers, one of which is psychological safety, but it's by no means the only one, and it's certainly not the one that explains this. So what I want to do is just jump to the third and last, and in many ways most novel phenomenon of teaming across organizations in larger ecosystems to get really new, ambitious innovations done. And I'll just give you two sort of reasonably quick examples, cases that I've done over I have about 10 or 12 of these, but I'll give you two. Actually, the first one, building a new city from scratch, is two parts because I have two cities. I have one that worked and one that didn't. And then the second one, I imagine you all know something about already, which was the rescue of 33 trapped Chilean miners about 10 years ago. Okay. This is a great quote, I think, from Paul Pullman, who's the CEO of Unilever, who makes the point that the issues we face, and he doesn't mean Unilever, he means we, human beings on spaceship Earth, are so big and so challenging we cannot do it alone. And there's a certain humility and a recognition that we need to invite other people in. When you look at any issue, and for here it might be, he says, food or water scarcity, it might be poverty, it might be educational achievement, it might be error in healthcare. It's clear that no individual institution, government, or company can provide the solution alone. So this is kind of expressing the need. It's real and growing. A gentleman we interviewed at Cisco a number of years ago as part of one of these Smart City from Scratch projects puts this in a very positive and sort of hopeful way. He says it's going to be about bringing people and competencies together from different industries, different perspectives, much less about any organization doing it all by itself, more about partnerships, more about people who can help bridge these competencies. So there's almost a description of a new skill set, like bridgers needed, right? We need these people who can bridge. And what is it that we're trying to bridge? I want to be very clear about that. I think it's something that's going to be somewhat like cultural differences, and I don't mean national cultural differences. So the challenge here is that we all are recognizing in a growing way the need for this kind of work, but we're also recognizing that it's really hard, right? So this is a list that you can readily recognize as fairly descriptive of what routine operations look like, whether you're in a factory or a hospital or somewhere else. Thankfully, at least some portion of the work we do is still predictable and manageable, and we know who's responsible for what. The cross-industry innovation projects of the type I started to study are different in every single way, on every dimension. You know, radical uncertainty, complex interdependencies that can't be predicted or scripted in advance, unlike, by the way, the CT scan, which can be scripted and is scripted in advance. You know, multiple competing criteria, often unclear and conflicting authority, but the one I want to emphasize here for the rest of the session, the teaming at the third level session, is this challenge, this very real and deeper than we thought challenge of integrating across areas of expertise, right? It turns out that experts have a kind of culture of their own that they begin to take for granted, right? They're unaware of having. Many people have called this stuff on the right, you know, wicked problems. Wicked problems are those that are really quite hard and sometimes even not possible to solve. But the thing I just want to zoom in on is this thing of culture clash. How do we detect it? How do we confront it? And just to give you, I'll give you, so the book that Jody mentioned, I mean, that Monica mentioned of Building the Future, really the main point of that book is culture clash. You know, we were so excited to follow this project. It was a very exciting project. And finally, we began to realize these people aren't talking to each other. I know that surprises you, but I'll show you some of the just quick data points that we found, right? So this is a project manager from a very well-regarded, very successful construction firm in the UK, talking about the software startup that they've partnered with in this project. He says, we're dealing with IT people when it comes to this company, and they're different. That's different bad, not different good. We actually have to build things, you know, and this goes on. From the other side, from the CEO of the software company, he says, and this is a compliment about the head of the real estate, the CEO of the real estate company, he says, he's not your typical real estate developer. I meet too many people from real estate who haven't got a clue, right? So he's sort of saying this guy is great because he doesn't really represent his industry in the normal way. And another one, a global electronics firm that was involved, they make the sensors and some of the software, says, they still drive me nuts. And he's talking about the startup guys. He says, they're getting better, but one of my pet peeves is the culture of the organization. Their timekeeping is atrocious. The only thing they're quick to do is make a promise. They're very slow to deliver, and it drives me nuts. And I love this because he says, it drives me nuts because I find it terribly frustrating and terribly uncourteous. Strange word, but that is the word he used. Uncourteous. So what I love about this quote is that this guy was very aware of the fact that it wasn't fair to brand the behavior rude. He knew they didn't intend it to be rude. He also knew he couldn't help feeling it as rude. Right? So we have many of these, and essentially as you analyze them qualitatively, what you find is very deep, very taken for granted differences across professional domains in values. Time frames is a big one. You know, real estate are pretty comfortable thinking in terms of decades. Software, not so long at all, obviously. Behavioral norms about meetings, about what you wear. Formal education levels that are required to do this job. Is there credentialing or not? And so on and so forth. And of course, risk tolerance. It's okay to have a little bug in your software. You can fix it tomorrow. It's not okay for your building to fall down, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we began to detect in these teaming within ecosystems projects was the ubiquity of generally taken for granted negative attributions about the folks in the other camp. Like when things weren't going well, and remember, these are complex innovation projects that are likely not going to be going well right off the bat. We find it's always somebody else's fault, somewhat like this, right? Technical glitch, human error. It's a nice illustration, if you will, of the fundamental attribution error. And you might think this is a hopeless task, so I just have to quickly share a couple of successes. And this is one with a doctoral student, Tiona Zazul, now a professor at the University of Washington. We did a case study on this. What you see here is really just a part of the central cluster in what's called Lake Nona Medical City, 30 miles from Orlando in Florida. A decade ago, that was 7,000 acres of empty land. Today, it's a thriving, quite innovative medical ecosystem with research organizations, the first new VA hospital in a long time, a new medical school at University of Central Florida, offices and research groups from J&J and many other groups, and very, new greenhouses and on it goes. So they decided to sort of from scratch build this town with a emphasis on health care writ large. Now, how did they pull that off in less than 10 years' time? Well, as they describe it, it was a very eclectic group of entities that came together to team up to get this done. A large research university, a private biomedical research foundation, and many other players. And the question that they encountered at the outset, very deliberately, was how do we sift through all of this and do something new together? And I'm going to give you ultimately what our analysis was of, in these sort of 10 projects, that this is one of them. What did we see in common? What kind of approach did they take in managing these sort of wicked problems? And the approach, I would argue, had to do two things, or really two sets of two things. One is it had to motivate people and channel their energy into really getting something done, especially when they encounter hurdles, which they do all the time. And the other is enabling or removing barriers that get in the way. These sets of leadership activities focused on both technical challenges and sort of psychological or interpersonal challenges. And so the first one that we talk about, that we discovered is of course, vision. Right? Setting a vision, setting an inspiring vision that gets people excited and wanting to work hard to get this done, but it cannot be an unwavering, we got it all figured out kind of vision. It has to be one that is deliberately allowed to morph over time for two reasons. One, as I invite these strangers in to partner with me, they bring stuff that will inform the vision. And number two, as we team up and make progress together, it will shift as more is learned because we are in new territory. The head of the Lake Nona organizing team here said, we don't come to our partners with specifics about what we want from them, but rather we try to paint a picture of what we're doing and let them come to us with what they might offer. So it's this invitation to shape the vision together that makes it kind of adaptable. The second, I don't need to dwell on this one here, I've talked enough about it already, but to create psychological safety, to give people very explicitly, again and again and again, permission to raise crazy ideas, to ask for help, to say when they don't understand something, to say when they find something uncourteous, and so on and so forth. The third is to really go out of your way to create forums for knowledge sharing across disciplinary boundaries, to get together and dig in, to use advocacy and inquiry in equal measure, to understand where people are coming from, what they know, what they bring, what's the treasure, what are you up against, what do you bring? And these were often done at Lake Nona. It was done in a very, very thoughtful way, and I love this quote from one of the planners. It was a city planner from Orlando, actually. He said, we rub off each other. We've been working together. I've been trained with this skill, but we bring our value sets and our training with us, and I've learned an incredible amount from them, and I hope they can say the same about me. I find myself using vocabulary and terms a few years ago I didn't even know. So here's this person really showing us the feeling of learning and growing and developing his own thinking and skills from participating on a project like this. And then last but not least, encouraging what I like to think of as execution as learning. We can't just stand here and wait till we have the perfect plan to execute. We have to execute without knowing how it's all going to turn out and learn as we go. And I've written a lot about that. There's much more I could say, but it's more than anything else a mindset that works. Now, I don't want to take I want to make sure we have time to talk. So I'll just put this one up here as an extraordinary example of teaming across boundaries, many different sectors, from NASA to mining to oil to government to UPS to corporate sectors, came together and did something absolutely remarkable and unprecedented and innovative to accomplish something that everybody believed was impossible to accomplish. I could talk about it for many hours, but I won't. I'll just put it up there as another magnificent example of teaming at this level 3 to accomplish the impossible. And then let's open it up. And at the end, I'll share a final recipe for success in a VUCA world.
Wonderful. So what have you been thinking about? Let's share a couple of questions for Amy, and then as she said, she will wrap it up. I know I have plenty of questions, but let's hear from you. We'll run around the mics. Yeah.
Yep. It's not working. Hi, Don. Oh, maybe you turned it off. Speak very loudly. Yeah.
There we go. So Don Goldman, Institute for Healthcare Improvement, Boston Children's. Thank you, Amy. It was terrific. First, a real quick throwaway comment. The big buzzword in healthcare today is learning healthcare system. And I haven't heard nearly enough consideration of what you've been saying in that whole dialogue. So I hope you'll contribute to that.
So there's work to be done.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
But here's the question. There were two words that came up today. One was equity in the introduction, and on a cartoon there was the word fit. I'd like to ask a question in relationship to the grid of high standards and psychological safety. Yep. Some years ago at IHI, we were an entirely white organization with one person being black. There was a need to hire a research assistant by a team, and they interviewed people, and there were two incredibly qualified people from Harvard and Yale. One was a black male, the other was a white woman. And what I heard was this white woman would be a better fit. And I'm just wondering the degree to which devotion to equity, really taking it seriously, perturbs that grid. Because I can imagine that if you have great fit, you can have great teams. If you bring in diversity, it may perturb the system for a while. So can you comment on that, please?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Don. I was going to try to pull the grid back, but I won't. You know it, right? 2 by 2. So I think fit is not the word we really want to be using, right? I mean, I understand where it comes from. I mean, to me, fit is a little bit more in the comfort zone than in the learning zone, right? So I learn more when I'm just, I'm stretching. I'm reaching across like that geographer planner was to get new knowledge that I didn't have before. Do they, does that person fit, that software person or that, VA chief executive? No, not at all. Do I learn more? Can we innovate together? Absolutely. So, I mean, maybe, I'm not going to say don't hire people who you feel fit. We do it all the time. But I am going to say think carefully about what your objectives are, not for the hiring, but for the institution. Right? What is your goal? What does the IHI need and want to do? And if it's, if it's more to the left, if it's more, okay, we got these formulae, we just need to get the very best marketing and implementation science we have and get it in place, we could make a stronger argument, I think, for hiring for fit. If it's innovate, help us think in brand new ways we haven't thought about before. How do we think about healthcare systems that haven't been on our radar before? Then I think we need the person who thinks differently. Will that make us less comfortable? Very likely. Will it make us learn more? Yes, if. Right? It will help us learn more if it's well led, if it's well managed. And
the good news is we hired the black male and now have a reasonably diverse organization, and it's a little bit uncomfortable.
Okay, all good, yeah. As long as we're learning.
Let's see, oh my gosh, a lot of, yeah, oh, you already did. Okay, good. I'll get ready for the next one.
Thank you. I'd like to take this precious opportunity to ask your suggestions for our reform of healthcare system in China. Actually, right now we are at a very initial stage of healthcare system reform. I can't agree more with your 3 levels. I just wondering, could you give us some suggestions how to make it happen in China, individual level? Actually, I have so much influence from our environment. We have so many regulations and policies delivered by our central government or the local government. They will try to follow that guidelines and try to settle down the regulations. And the individuals will interact with that regulations, put them into implementation, And how to let them interact positively with each other. I think that's across industries and organizations, individual levels, all of that. Could you give us some suggestions? Thank you.
Yesterday, and as I was sitting in my office and emails are flowing in, one email that flowed in was from the publisher of Teaming, Wiley, with the good news that Teaming has just been translated, or it's just coming out. It was translated recently in Chinese, right? So it's coming out. They said I'll have one in my mailbox in 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. So you can take that book back and everybody can read it in a language that may be more comfortable. But I think the very fact that you're here is doing part of what we're saying to do, which is to reach across boundaries, to learn from people in other sectors, countries, people who have experimented, especially in healthcare delivery around the world. There are so many interesting and exciting experiments going on, and I don't mean experiments in the scientific sense, but experiments in the delivery sense of really helping people implement new practices, and especially new teaming practices in ecosystems, like the work IHI does, that are well worth studying and bringing back. Right? And it doesn't mean it's going to be bring back, here's the blueprint, get it done. It's going to be bring back, here's an idea, how do we make it our own?
I thought there were some hands back here. Yes. Okay.
Hi, Amy. I'm Madeline Biondolillo from Premier, VP of Quality and Safety. Thanks for your talk. Always fantastic. And looking forward to the new book. So my question is, this Chilean miners rescue, that was an urgent matter. The teams had to come together. There was no, failure not an option kind of thing. Unfortunately, failure is an option too much in the world that keeps me having a job, unfortunately. I'd love to not have to have a job. Is there any, as much as I love the constructs that you show, is there a stepwise approach that you've studied that is instructive? In other words, do we start, for example, with teams that are naturally cooperative and productive and grow to include others that are maybe not so much at the beginning? Is that something that goes on?
I think it depends. I think it's going to depend on what is the goal, what is it you're trying to do. I do want to just, I want to say one quick thing in defense of this case as an example, right? Because in fact, failure was an option. It was considered by nearly everybody involved at the beginning, the 99% option, and that was just being kind, right? The 1% wasn't considered by anybody a truly realistic possibility that we would see those men again. They decided, in fact, through a sheer act of leadership, to go for it. And the way they described that, and I'll make this very short, but the way they described that was, ultimately, it will be a very meaningful win, and not a trivial one, if we can bring the bodies back for a decent burial. The possibility that we could actually bring them back alive was almost not we couldn't discuss it. So it was very easy, and in every other case prior to this, to walk away, that's what would have happened. So now why do I say that? Not just in defense of this case, but in fact, I think, and whenever I teach this case, it always gets to the point where someone in some company will say, yeah, but that was a crisis, so that brings out the best. It's like, yes, and your job as a leader is to bring out the best without the crisis. So my more pragmatic answer to your question is, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, how you start and where you start, and whether you kind of start slow and add to it. But what I think is most important is framing the work and framing the context. When you keep reminding people that we're in this remarkably complex, interdependent, uncertain landscape, it just lets them know again and again and again that their voice matters. Right? So you're always setting the rationale for voice, like why we need you. You know, if we had this beautiful little program you could just follow, we wouldn't, you know, we'd just say, go do it, right? But so you're always saying, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're up against, I need your help. And you're saying that in the small, in the medium, and in the large. And you're always saying, you know, we're not gonna get it right the first time. We probably aren't gonna get it right the second time, but we're gonna die trying, right? We're just gonna keep tacking up wind until we get there.
Okay, I'm definitely want to turn it back to you. This has been amazing, and I just so inspiring. Absolutely, Jody. We knew it would be inspiring. You know, your ability to think across levels and to help us kind of think about what questions we still have. So that last question is a really interesting one about how do you actually implement this and the sequencing and the timing.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about MySpace, we know we have a crisis, certainly in this country.
we don't have to sell that.
But we don't have to sell that. So the framing is there.
I agree.
But like, how do we create the conditions, which is all your work, and the sequencing to enable change? So just fabulous. Please join me. And you want to say one more word?
I'll just say one last thing. Yeah, in fact, I would love, you know, this is the work we need to do, and I think we need to team up to do it, because I sure as heck don't have the answers. But I will say, and it's a little bit, I'm being a little bit flippant, but not really. I actually mean it very seriously. I do think there is a formula, right? But the formula is a little bit, it's going to be a little bit abstract, so it won't necessarily solve your problem. But it does start with aim high. And that's, you know, whether it's the triple aim or the quadruple aim, whether it's getting 33 men out of a 2,000-foot hole, is rock, covered by rock harder than granite, whatever it is, aim high. You know, there's just no point in showing up if you're not going to, you know, go for gold, right? And if you're going to aim high, meaning to go after something really ambitious that hasn't been done before, like it or not, you're going to have to team up with people who are different from you. And if you team up with people who are different from you pursuing something terribly ambitious, you will fail, right? So fail well, right? And fail well means avoid the preventable kind, mitigate the kind of complex kind, and embrace the intelligent failures, which is basically I do something new in new territory and we learn from it because no one's ever been there before, and then finally learn fast. So aim high, team up, fail well, learn fast. That's it, except there's a fifth step. I hate to admit it, repeat. Right? It never stops. So thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you, Amy.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amy. That was